Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're jumping straight into a deeply focused journey. We are going to unpack exactly how industry, empire, and some fiercely competing ideologies fundamentally reshape the world we live in today. If you want to know how the modern world actually got its shape, well, you're in exactly the right place. We're going to chart a course right through the history, the data, and the shifting paradigms that define global history over the last few centuries. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think about a set of train tracks stretching way out into the horizon. It's honestly the perfect metaphor for the massive, completely undeniable momentum of the Industrial Revolution. Once this whole engine of modernity got moving, it laid down tracks that crossed continents and hooked up totally disparate societies in ways that had just never happened before. But as we're going to see, these tracks didn't just move cargo and people. They carried profound social transformations, a staggering human cost, and some incredibly intense global power shifts.
So, to untangle this massive global history, we'll follow a clear agenda today. First, we've got the engines of modernity. Second, defining the nation-state. Third, the imperial web. Fourth, competing notions of civilization. And finally, number 5, displacing indigenous peoples.
All right, Section 1, Engines of Modernity, Different Tracks to the Future.
It's absolutely crucial to understand right from the jump that there was no single universal blueprint for industrializing. Different nations took entirely different paths depending on when they got started and what resources they actually had on hand. For the longest time, people just assumed Britain provided the master template everyone else had to copy, but that's just not true. In Britain, the world's first industrial nation, the early phase was all about coal and cotton textiles. Railways didn't really kick in until the second phase. But then look at Russia. They started way later. Late 19th century, and they didn't bother retracing Britain's early steps. Nope, they skipped right ahead and threw their immediate focus into railways and heavy industry right out of the gate. It just shows us that countries were learning from each other rather than strictly copying one specific model.
Now, obviously, this rapid progress, it didn't come for free. The momentum of modernity exacted a severe, devastating human and material cost globally. In Britain, you had the terrible plight of the laboring poor, especially the children, alongside just massive environmental degradation. We're talking deadly epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis spreading like wildfire. And hey, this wasn't just a Western issue. Over in Japan, indiscriminate industrial pollution caused cadmium and mercury poisoning, which was so bad it literally stirred the public into mass protests. The whole drive for progress took a very real, very visceral toll on human lives and the environment.
But, to be fair, the story of modernity is also full of some pretty staggering achievements. Let's stick with Japan for a second. Consider the year 1910. Did you know that by 1910, tuition fees for primary schools in Japan had practically ended? They hit virtually universal enrollment. Japan completely managed to dodge colonial control and achieved this wildly rapid economic progress. I mean, just think about what universal primary education in 1910 actually means for a nation's ability to modernize and compete globally. It's a massive milestone, and it totally paved the way for their astonishing 20th century trajectory.
Moving right along to Section 2, Defining the Nation-State. Who belongs?
Now, what's really interesting about this is that as economies were completely transforming, political identities were shifting right along with them. Nationalism is actually a surprisingly modern concept, mostly because it's rooted in popular sovereignty, this idea that political power should actually sit with the people. But here's the catch. How you define the people changes literally everything. At the heart of the modern nation-state is this fundamental ideological clash. On one side, you have civic nationalism. This vests sovereignty in everyone based purely on citizenship, regardless of language or religion. It's about rights exercising citizens. But on the flip side, we have ethnic nationalism. And this builds solidarities around very specific things, a shared language, religion, or tradition. In multi-ethnic countries, ethnic nationalism can end up limiting sovereignty to a quote-unquote chosen people, sometimes totally marginalizing minority communities. This exact tension between inclusive citizenship and exclusive ethnicity has shaped modern history everywhere, from Germany to India, China, and Japan. And honestly, it's a tension we literally still see dominating global headlines today.
Section 3, the Imperial Web, Capital and Control.
So, all this growing national power and capitalist expansion inevitably started looking outward. Western capitalism and early 20th century Japanese capitalism began carving out these vast empires across the globe. But imperialism wasn't just a simple copy-paste job. There were 3 very distinct variants, used to compromise local sovereignty. First, you had settler colonies, like in South Africa and the Americas, where huge numbers of immigrants showed up and just stayed.
Second, there was direct rule, which is best exemplified by the British in India. And third, you have the really complex case of the semi-colony, like China in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In China, powers like Britain, France, America, Germany, and Japan didn't directly take over the state. Instead, they constantly meddled, exploiting resources from the outside in and seriously compromising Chinese sovereignty without formally planting a flag.
Let's put this into perspective and map out just how incredibly fast the world was shrinking. The West was in constant, rapid motion. You go from the massive political earthquake of the French Revolution in 1789 right into literal geographical engineering. The Suez Canal opens in 1869, the Panama Canal in 1914. They're just cutting straight through continents to hook up the oceans. And by 1927, Charles Lindbergh is flying solo across the Atlantic. The sheer pace of technological and political connection during this window was absolutely blistering.
But, and this is crucial, we have to look at the parallel timeline of what was happening simultaneously across Africa and Asia. Sure, the Suez Canal opening in 1869 changed global trade, but we also see massive political resistance brewing. By 1906, Mahatma Gandhi is over in South Africa advocating satyagraha to resist racist laws. We see the horrific formal establishment of apartheid in 1948. And then by 1955, the Bandung Conference happens, which completely strengthens the non-aligned movement. So even as the imperial web was being spun globally, these powerful anti-colonial movements were simultaneously rising up to challenge it.
And this brilliantly illustrates how all this global connectivity wasn't just about politics or shipping lanes. It profoundly rewired human culture and art. Look at works from the 1920s, like J. Lipchitz' sculpture Figure, which wears the influence of Central African statuary right on its sleeve, or the incredible Japanese Zen paintings from the era. These exact kinds of works were deeply, deeply admired by Western creators and directly fed into the abstract expressionist movement in 1920s America. The world was literally talking to itself through art, sharing these visual languages across massive imperial divides.
Section 4. Competing notions of civilization. Land versus commodity.
As European settlers relentlessly expanded into the Americas and Australia, they crashed headfirst into native populations who viewed the world in a fundamentally different way. Just take a second to really hear this Native American perspective. If you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them? Native peoples generally didn't feel the need to own land or fish or animals. The concept of turning nature into a commodity to be bought and sold was totally absurd to them. They operated on a gift economy. So to them, these European settlers arriving with an obsession to divide, fence off, and sell every inch of the earth, they seemed completely alien and honestly entirely uncivilized.
Now, contrast that native viewpoint with how the German philosopher Karl Marx saw things. He starkly described the American frontier as the last positive capitalist utopia, the limitless nature and space to which the limitless thirst for profit adapts itself. For the European settlers, the bourgeois mentality meant absolutely everything, down to the dirt and the water, was a commodity with a price tag. What we're looking at here are two totally, completely incompatible definitions of what it actually means to be a civilization.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, Displacing Indigenous Peoples, the Cost of Expansion. That massive ideological clash, it had devastating, real-world consequences. To make room for European immigrants, native peoples were systematically pushed out. Over in North America, leaders like Thomas Jefferson had this grand vision of a country filled with European-style small farms. So the natives were displaced, and later, the governments of the US and Canada actively pressured them to just abandon their cultures entirely and assimilate into the quote-unquote mainstream. Meanwhile, down in Australia, during the exact same period, the authorities took a slightly different, but equally destructive route. They adopted a policy of simply attempting to ignore Aboriginal traditions and culture altogether, acting as if they basically didn't exist.
Which really brings us to a profound concept coined by the anthropologist W.E.H. Stanner in 1968. He called it the Great Australian Silence. He was talking about the absolute deafening silence of historians when it came to the Aborigines. It literally took until the 1970s for mainstream academia to actually show an eagerness to understand Native communities, not as museum curiosities, but as complex, vibrant cultures with deep understandings of nature, vast histories, and incredible art. So I want to leave you with a question to chew on. If economic and political power so heavily dictates what becomes a mainstream culture, then who truly gets to write the narrative of modernity? And whose voices are we still missing from our history books right now? Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning the history you've been taught.